It's Matt Kirkner, your host for the Tech Ed Podcast. As we get closer to our 18-month anniversary, we are so proud of how far we've come. We've been joined by high-profile leaders of Fortune 500 companies, chancellors and presidents of educational institutions, governors, assistant secretaries of labor, other public policymakers, and the list goes on. And as we seek to push technical education forward and secure the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent, it appears to be working. Every week, we add new followers, more downloads, and more intriguing content. At least that's what we think, but we need to know what you think. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please take the time to leave us a review. If you find us every week on Spotify, know that there's now an option on that platform to leave us a review and give us 5 stars. Your feedback and support will further our mission and help us to continue to bring you the best content possible. On this week's episode of the Tech Ed Podcast, we are going to talk about what I believe will go down as the most significant scientific expedition of 2022. Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. It is a story that has captivated generations. It is a story of survival, of commitment, of tenacity, and of the human spirit. Sir Ernest Shackleton and his ship, the Endurance, is a story that has fascinated more than a century of human beings. And that story added yet another chapter earlier this year, when a South African icebreaker left port in search of the wreck of the Endurance in the Weddell Sea. Today, we are going to hear the story of Shackleton. We will hear the story of his ship, of his crew, and of the expedition in 2022 with an attempt to locate the wreck of the Endurance. We'll also hear about an organization that is inspiring youth to be more curious and more confident and more compassionate global citizens. And all of this, by the way, with an individual who is on board that South African icebreaker when it left on its expedition. Today, I'd like to introduce on the Tech Ed Podcast, Tim Jacob. Tim is the director of the Traveler Program at Reach the World. Tim, it's great to have you on.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So all of this amazing perspective that you have on this expedition, let's start out by just tell us from your viewpoint, what is the story of the Endurance?
Yeah, I would love to. It's the perfect story, really, in so many aspects, and a really fun story to tell. It's a story that I could tell in a 10-hour version or a 10-minute version. I'll try to go quickly. Ernest Shackleton was a British explorer. He was born in Ireland, but lived most of his life in England. Had 4 major Antarctic expeditions. The one that we're talking about today was his 3rd. He was kind of obsessed with the idea of reaching the South Pole during what's known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Really liked these romantic concepts of being the first person to stand at the South Pole, and was kind of obsessed by it. He was not that great of a student. Like he dropped out of school when he was about 16, preferred more like on-the-job learning, and took to the sea, worked on ships for many years before getting into Antarctic exploration. During his first 2 expeditions, he was part of teams that got closer and closer to the South Pole. It was his 2nd expedition where he got within about 100 miles of the South Pole, which seems like pretty far away still, but closer than anyone else had gotten before, and it earned him a degree of notoriety in the UK. And he went back to England and was immediately planning another expedition to go to the South Pole, to be the first one there. And while he was back in England, he got the word that a Norwegian, Roald Amundsen, had achieved the South Pole. It had beaten him to it. And I sometimes like to think about what it was like in his house the day that he found out that someone else had beaten him to this prize. But he was not a quitter. He was an endurance. Endurance was really his motto. So he immediately came up with a new plan, which was to be the first to cross the Antarctic continent on foot via the newly reached South Pole. So it's kind of a one-upsmanship exploration and expedition. And in order to do that, he bought a ship that was originally designed to take tourists to hunt for polar bears in the Arctic. And so it was kind of really one of the strongest ships of its day. It was called Polaris at the time, and he immediately renamed it Endurance after his family motto, which was by endurance we conquer. He kept the star on the back of the ship, which was part of the naming of the ship Polaris, but then changed the name of the ship to Endurance and wrote Endurance over the top. So he took off from England right on the cusp of the beginning of the First World War. In fact, the day he left from England, England entered World War I. And he sent a famous cable to Winston Churchill, who at the time was the Admiral of the Navy, and Churchill told him to proceed. So he traveled down to Buenos Aires, and then on to South Georgia Island, where the Norwegian whalers on South Georgia Island told him, absolutely do not go to the Weddell Sea. Your ship's going to get stuck. You're not going to make it. And he was brave. Some people say brave. Some people say was going to pursue it no matter what. And he went for it. And his ship, Endurance, got stuck in the ice of the Weddell Sea before he was able to reach the Antarctic continent. The ice of the Weddell Sea sort of spins in a clockwise pattern. It's called a gyre. And as his ship was stuck in that ice for about 9 months, it kept traveling north. And over the course of about 9 months, the ice of the Weddell Sea crushed and sort of poked some holes in the side of the Endurance, so it started taking on water, and then it eventually sank in the northern Weddell Sea. And so Shackleton is not famous for having achieved his expeditionary goal. He did not actually cross Antarctic. What he's most well known for is what happened next, which was the ultimate survival of all the members of that ship in the months following the sinking of Endurance. So in brief, they got on the rowboats, lifeboats. They traveled to Elephant Island, which is just a craggy outcropping in the far South Atlantic, not really hospitable to long-term life. Shackleton left most of the expedition there, and with several other expedition members, undertook what is still today one of the craziest open ocean journeys ever attempted, which was a journey of, I think, about 700 nautical miles across the really wavy, really rough South Atlantic Ocean to South Georgia Island. He made it amazingly, thanks largely to the navigational skills of Frank Worsley, the captain of Endurance. Ended up on the wrong side of South Georgia Island, had to, sort of in this half-starved state, be the first to climb the mountains of South Georgia using, no special mountain climbing equipment, and eventually arrived in Stromness, which was a whaling port in South Georgia, and found rescue. So the story of Shackleton and Endurance is one of survival, persistence. Everybody on the Endurance survived. Like I said, there were others who were part of the Ross Sea Party, another part of the expedition, who did die as part of this expedition. But in the end, Shackleton managed to secure the safety of most of his crew. So that's why we know Shackleton. We think of him as an example of leadership and persistence, despite really the kinds of odds that most people would quit.
It's just an incredible story, and I love hearing it. I love hearing it from your viewpoint, that whole motto, by endurance we conquer, and that is something that wasn't just a motto. It was something that clearly, by that story, Sir Ernest Shackleton absolutely lived by, to have that commitment, just an amazing commitment to other human beings, to make sure that you leave no person behind. It's just a great lesson for not just for the story in particular, but a great life lesson as well. Now here we are 107 years later, something like that. People, even before this amazing expedition that we're going to get into, have been talking about this story for literally generations. What do you think, Tim, is so captivating about Ernest Shackleton, about the crew of the Endurance, that has made the story, and I'll say the mystery of the ship, so legendary after more than a century?
I think it's two things. One, the things that Shackleton and his crew did successfully, getting in and out of the Weddell Sea, are still difficult today, are still very, very difficult. After 107 years, these are things that are almost as challenging today as they were back then. So there's a lot of ability on the part of modern day scholars to really recognize the extraordinary feat of crossing the South Atlantic in a rowboat, which is crazy. The second is that Shackleton really understood the value of media and of storytelling and had a very talented photographer on board Endurance. And even when they had to make really hard decisions about what to leave behind and what to take with them, they prioritized the bringing of Frank Hurley's glass slides. Some of the, not all of them, but many of the slides of photos that he took of the ship being crushed, of their journey, of their survival. It's a very visual story, so it's easy for us in this media-rich modern time to understand how difficult it was because it's so well documented with images.
And for that reason, now we're able to share this incredible experience and this incredible story. And you got to share that in just an amazing way. As you and I have discussed, I've always been fascinated by exploration. When I was a kid and we sent the Mars rover to Mars, I had this whole scrapbook. Like every time there was a color newspaper photo, speaking of old time media, I'd cut that out. I still have that scrapbook of the Mars expedition. Always been fascinated by Everest. Really any kind of conquering of some big physical challenge is something that I've been fascinated by. I can't imagine what it must have been like to get involved with the expedition to attempt to locate the Endurance in the Weddell Sea. How did you become a part of that?
Well, I give a lot of credit, first of all, to the people like you were discussing who took problems that would be considered by many to be totally impossible or just wild to even attempt and thought, let's do it. Let's give it a try. Let's apply all of our brain power to solving this problem. I was sort of a later addition to the expedition. I was not part of the team that came up with this idea to find most challenging shipwreck in the world. But to their great credit, and there's an organization called the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust, which really organized this whole expedition. And from the beginning, as they were thinking about going after the shipwreck, they may, perhaps in the spirit of Hurley, really understood the value of sharing something like this with the public and really getting a widespread public audience to follow along. And in today's time, you can do that in real time. We don't have to wait months for a telegram or pictures to arrive by mail. So employing the most modern technology, in the case of my education program, virtual exchange using video calls and articles published to the internet in real time. But also things like TikTok, there are definitely TikTok videos being made on the deck of the ship of the icebreaker above where Ernest Shackleton's ship sank. So, in this age of modern media, storytelling, to the great credit of the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust, was a central part of this expedition from the beginning.
So I'll tell you, one of the things, Tim, I had an opportunity to do, this goes back probably 20 years ago. There was an icebreaker, actually the U.S. Coast Guard acquired 3 of these, and one of them sailed to Milwaukee. And because I had some good friends that were part of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, I got an opportunity to tour the whole thing. And if, for folks that aren't familiar with how those things work and how they use, how they use physics and how they use speed and how they use, the movement of water and ballast and so on to break ice, that it's just incredible technology in and of itself. But I'm curious just on this whole idea of being on an icebreaker for, if I'm right, more than 40 days. What was it like to live on an icebreaker? What do you spend your time doing during this expedition?
Well, that's a good question. I had not previously spent a lot of time on ships. Less than a week was my previous record. So being on a ship of this nature was a new experience for me. The expedition chose the Agulhas II for very good reason. It's an amazing ship owned by the South African government. It is perfect, custom built for cutting through or breaking through the ice of the Weddell Sea. What it is not perfect for, in my opinion, is traveling 3,000 nautical miles from Cape Town across the roaring 40s and the furious 50s. Because, a lot of the cruise ships that travel from the bottom of South America to the Antarctic Peninsula have things like stabilizers off the side of the ship that keep it from rocking. And if you tried to put those on an icebreaker, they would break off as soon as you got into the ice. That big chunks of ice would just clip them right off the side. So the Agulhas II is very rolly from side to side. Thanks to the considerable skill of the captain of the Agulhas II, that was minimized during our journey. But we still traveled through several storms during that 10-day journey from Cape Town to the Weddell Sea, to the ice edge. And I think at most we were rolling about 15 degrees, 20 degrees side to side. I describe this to students as a roller coaster you can't get off of. So it takes a few days to get used to that feeling. It is very exciting. It also can be kind of nauseating, as any sailor or person who's dealt with seasickness can tell you. But after a few days, I got used to it. And having that time before we actually got to the Weddell Sea and the active part of our search began was a great opportunity to explore every square inch of that ship. Part of my unique role on the ship was sharing all the stories, all the things happening on the ship with kids. And it was fun to be able to just employ sort of a kid level curiosity to every aspect of the ship. I was down in the engine room, I was in the helicopter hangar, I was up on the bridge, I was everywhere all over that ship. So once I got my sea legs, I spent a lot of time meeting the crew, meeting the other expedition members, exploring every inch of the ship and really getting to know it well so that I could then share it with kids.
Yeah, it's just a one of a kind experience. And, I think about, just to put that into perspective for our audience a little bit, when you talk about the roaring 40s and the furious 50s, you're talking about the degrees of latitude below the equator where you're traveling to, and as a lifelong boater, I've done a ton of reading about, for a while, I was fascinated with these like round the world stories of people taking their boats around, around Cape Horn to literally circumnavigate the earth, and just the harrowing stories of what the weather can be like. I don't know that there's any way, I've never been there, but I don't even know that there's any way that you can explain that or put it into perspective, how brutal that environment is that you're in, and spending those 40 days. So what an amazing, it's just incredible adventure.
It's brutal, but it's also beautiful because we were outside of shipping lanes. We saw no other boats. We saw no other people. We were surrounded by whales. There were beautiful sunsets, spectacular storm clouds. So if you look for the beauty in it too, you can definitely see it. One of the things you might appreciate, Matt, is that part of our education program, Reach the World paired classrooms in South Africa with classrooms in the United States to adopt these really smart weather buoys that were being deployed by the South African Weather Service. So once we reached a certain latitude, we were deploying these buoys every degree of latitude, whether it was stormy, whether it was day or night. Like when we reached the latitude, the buoy had to go over. So part of my journey down there was working with the oceanographers from the South African Weather Service to, get up at 3 a.m. in 8-foot swells and put on my life jacket and, take this really high-tech Argo float, which is a whole other fascinating topic. And, sort of like waves crashing over the back deck, and we're holding on and launching this buoy and getting back inside as quickly as we can, but also capturing that experience for kids. So that's one way that they could sort of live that experience alongside me.
That's a great story. And through the miracle of modern technology, allowing them to feel like they're right there with you through that entire experience. Here on the Tech Ed podcast, we talk all the time about these convergences between technologies, whether it's Industry 4.0 in manufacturing or telecommunications manufacturing. We've talked a lot this year about the convergence of industrial technology and art, believe it or not. And we talk a lot about smart technology, right? So that reference to a weather buoy that's using the same types of smart technology that we're seeing deployed in every other aspect of the economy and every other space around the globe. Just another example of how so many of these technologies are coming together and converging. So that was a great example. I want to turn to, for a moment now, this ship, that you described earlier in our podcast, 107 years ago, gets crushed by ice, fills with water, sinks to the bottom of the Weddell Sea, some, 9,500, 10,000 feet, something like that, to the bottom. And you get to be, as we've talked about, on the expedition to attempt to locate the Endurance. And not to ruin the story for our audience, you were successful in doing that. I just want to talk about this moment. I mean, you set out on this expedition. You don't know if you're going to be successful or not. You're investing tremendous amount of time. You're communicating with these students all around the globe. You've created these amazing partnerships, and you've got a crew of people using technology we'll talk about a little bit later that are searching for the wreck of the Endurance now, some 107 years later. Tell us about that moment when you realized that you had located the Endurance. How did you find out? And how did you and your fellow team members react to that discovery?
Sure. I'll take just a short step back to add like one bit of context because it makes the moment of discovery so much more gratifying. The variables around this expedition were astounding. COVID, people traveling from 12 different countries, arriving at Cape Town, not having COVID and testing negative to get on the ship. The moving sea ice of the Weddell Sea, the sea ice moves like in some cases almost a knot. So the sea ice is constantly moving, whether you feel it or not. So even just getting the ship to the position where we want to begin searching, long before you can get a marine robot down 10,000 feet to the seabed and start scanning, was just an astounding sort of array of challenges to get to. So we followed on the heels of a 2019 expedition that was not successful in finding the wreck. In fact, one of their like multi-million-dollar AUVs went missing. And as a result of what happened there, we learned a lot of lessons. And I say we collectively to the expedition, not me personally, but the team that was doing the subsea search, and even the navigator and crew of the SA Agulhas II. So just getting to the sink site in the Weddell Sea was an enormous accomplishment. Definitely wasn't a foregone conclusion. We had two plans. Plan A was to get to the sink site using the icebreaker. Absolutely ideal, because then we could look for the wreck off the back of the ship. The ship was a great home base. Food, shelter, warmth, all the things. Plan B, if we couldn't get to the wreck site because the ice was too thick, was to use the two helicopters that were on board to take everything required for the search, set it up on the ice as an ice camp, and basically break it all down and move it every 8 hours in between searches. It was would have been a constant schedule of helicopter flights. Everything had to be engineered to be underneath the weight limit of the helicopters. So the logistics and planning that went into this are sort of mind-boggling. Thankfully, we got to the sink site. We searched for 2 to 3 weeks without finding very much. There's not much on the bottom of the Weddell Sea. There's some whale skeletons. There's some drop stones, which are sort of get frozen into the bottom of glaciers. And then when the glaciers calve off into icebergs, the icebergs float in the sea ice and eventually drop these stones. So to sonar purposes, a drop stone could look like a ship really easily. So we'd have to go back and investigate and say, oh, no, that's a stone. So by the time we got to the end of the expedition, our search time in the Weddell Sea, winter was closing in fast. I would be remiss to not say that we were a little bit watching the weather and the plunging temperatures, and the distance from the ship to the edge of the sea ice had grown by about 40 miles during our 3 weeks there. So there was a little like subtle awareness that we needed to get out soon, that time was running short. So the moment where we actually spotted Endurance on sonar, and again by we, I mean the subsea team, when they saw the Endurance on the sonar, I felt a moment of great relief, followed by great excitement, because we knew we had exactly the amount of time we needed to do a really comprehensive survey of the wreck, including all of the really amazing gadgetry that was on the AUV, the autonomous underwater vehicle. We had just enough time to do it really, really well. And so that moment of relief was followed by some excitement, some controlled excitement, followed by some, let's like get this data and get it back on the ship so that we have it and no one can take it away from us, because we had sort of a drop dead date where we had to get out of there.
Expound on that excitement a little bit. So you're with a lot of, I'm guessing, fair number of STEMmy type people, all different personalities, but maybe sometimes those personalities tend to be a little bit more reserved, if I can generalize. Was it like a big party, hugs and high fives, or tell us about that?
You know, over the course of our time in the Weddell Sea, there were a lot of ups and downs. You know, we'd find small things and everyone would get very excited. It wasn't until the first images of Endurance, which was in such a beautiful state of preservation. It looked like it had sank the day before, and certainly not 107 years ago. As soon as we saw those images and we had a briefing, a whole expedition team briefing in the auditorium on the ship, where the subsea team showed the first 4K footage of the ship, you know, this like real slow flyover. You know, Menson Bound, the marine archaeologist, the chief of exploration for the expedition, was narrating, you know, look at that, you can see this was aboard that Chippy McNish wrote in his journal about that he took out so he could raise the sides of the James Caird for their cross-Atlantic journey. It's history that was just visible and palpable on the screen for us in 4K, which, you never get really. Sometimes shipwrecks are just piles of planks, or you have to really kind of close your eyes and imagine what it could have been. And this wasn't one of those cases. As soon as we saw the data coming up from the seabed, it was just pure exhilaration. And, there's so much to work with. There's so much to investigate as soon as we'd made that initial discovery.
Pure exhilaration. Thank you so much for sharing that moment with our audience, because I can feel that exhilaration and that excitement in your voice, and it must have been just an amazing time. Question out of curiosity. So by the time now you're ready to tie things up and start making your way back, how far are you from the edge of the sea ice?
When we first arrived in the Weddell Sea, we traveled through about 10 nautical miles of sea ice to reach the search area. We found the Endurance within the planned search box. So we were in the area we expected to be at the end of the search. And like I said, during that time, those ice conditions were being monitored very closely by a team of remote sensing scientists who were on board, including scientists from the German Aerospace Agency that was getting, from that day, fresh satellite pictures from German satellites, and also NASA satellites and Japanese Space Agency satellites. So we were very closely monitoring the movement of that ice, and it had grown over that 2 to 3 week period by about 40 nautical miles. So on our way out, we had to break through about 50 nautical miles of ice. When we speak about technology and the help of the science team in getting out of the ice, there were lots of ways we could figure out the path of least resistance, so to speak. But it was still, we were lucky in the ice conditions that we had, because it was relatively easy for the Agulhas II to get in and out.
Relatively easy. And I know in some of the reading I've done, that just to kind of, again, put it into perspective for the audience, I think I read that icebreaker can break through as much as a meter and a half, or was breaking through a meter and a half, 4.5 feet, give or take, of sea ice at a time at a speed of 8 knots. So for people who aren't maybe as familiar, I may be wrong about this. I think a knot is about 1.1 miles per hour. Am I right about that?
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah. So at that speed, with that thickness of ice, it's just incredible what that icebreaker is capable of. So you get out of the sea ice and you make your way to South Georgia Island. And I read somewhere that on South Georgia Island, you visited Sir Ernest Shackleton's gravesite. So now 107 years after the sinking of the Endurance, you found it. You're among the very first people to be above it, to see it on video. In what ways did that visit then to his gravesite kind of tie this whole expedition together for you, Tim?
Well, if you want a very goosebump inducing moment,
for sure,
it's that we found Endurance 100 years to the day after Shackleton was buried on South Georgia Island. On the 100th anniversary of his burial in South Georgia, we found his beloved Endurance, sitting more or less where it was last recorded.
Unbelievable.
So to be able to travel to South Georgia and visit his gravesite, and, in sort of a romantic version of how you think about things like this, we got to show him the first image of the ship since he saw it go down 107 years ago. So, it was a really beautiful ceremony at the gravesite. It was, being able to lay that image at the gravesite and talk about what it meant to everybody on the expedition. Everybody there had invested a lot of time and energy or money in achieving this goal, had overcome really significant odds. And when you're standing in a place like South Georgia Island, which is just a dramatic sub-Antarctic island with rocky crags and glaciers and amazing wildlife, it feels like you're in a special bubble of exploration in a way. I felt the same way when I knew I was standing on the sea ice above the Endurance. It was a place that Shackleton and his crew had been, and it did not look very different from what it would have looked like for him. It gave me, as a former social studies teacher and someone who loves history, a living example of what these stories tried to describe, and many describe very well about how hard it was for Shackleton to survive. I, of course, got to go in off the sea ice when I got a little cold and get some soup and warm up. And Shackleton and his crew spent months sleeping in tents on that ice. So being at his gravesite and just being maybe one of the a small group of people who could really understand those amazing physical feats that he and his crew accomplished. Felt very special.
But that is an incredible coincidence. And full disclosure, it did raise a few goosebumps on me. And what a great story. Ernest Shackleton, the Endurance and its crew, the expedition to locate and film the wreck, lying almost 2 miles below the sea ice at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. It's an intriguing story for sure, but at the end of this first episode with Tim Jacob, I still had so many questions for him. Imagine Shackleton in our world of today. Mobile phones, satellite phones, global positioning, space exploration, Starlink satellites, robots in space. He wouldn't even recognize the world in which we live. And this and similar technology not only made the discovery of the wreck of the Endurance possible, it enabled Tim to share his journey in real time with tens of thousands of young people around the globe. In our next episode with Tim, we'll discuss all of this. I'll ask him about Reach the World and the difference it is making, and what career opportunities exist for those supporting an expedition such as the one that he was on. We'll talk about the autonomous underwater vehicles and other technologies used to locate and film the wreck. If you were as fascinated by this first episode as I was, you don't want to miss episode 2. Join me next week on the Tech Ed podcast as we round out our conversation with Tim Jacob. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you like this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.